Hi,
Hi.
Andy. It's Malcolm here. It was a thing you said towards the end about the risk towards teachers
Yep.
that kind of stuck in my mind. And we've had a case here in Australia where someone's university lecture was taken from the online version in the university and shared with the media, and created all sorts of problems for that person. But it basically destroyed the idea that there's this trusted learning space where things can be said quite frankly. It seems to me that you don't get that anymore. You probably won't. Anything that is sad can get onto the front pages of the paper. I'm particularly interested in professional development for teachers, more so than doing stuff with kids, and about things around social emotional development is my area, and I could imagine sometimes teachers might share a problem or something, and then if they spoke about that in the wrong way, that could come back to things can be taken out of context. That seems to be the case. What happened in this university case I mentioned, and that gets pretty nasty. So I think there are risks for teachers, and the assumptions that everything is totally safe or no safety at all. Both those assumptions seem to be wrong. There's some be a little wary, but
Malcolm, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the I'll show you an analogy which is to a UK school, and I'm not going to name the school, I'm not going to name the area, but here's an example where a member of staff was off ill and posted the fact that in a very derogatory way that they caught the cold or whatever it was off the children, and failing to realise, of course, that some of the parents were Facebook friends of his on Facebook, and because his privacy settings weren't set correctly on his Facebook account, that got around very quickly. And what the interesting tale about that was discussed at a staff meeting, and what happened was a dozen or more teachers very quickly rushed off to various devices to change their Facebook settings because they hadn't even thought about it. I mean, I think you're quite right. I many years ago made a wish that I was going to flood. I would be private, but I would also tend to flood some of my media streams. I do Twitter occasionally with trivia. And I've stopped doing that now because I've realised the search tools for things like Twitter have improved so much that you actually can sort through the rubbish with keywords. So I think there is a real awareness. I think there's a big case now and a big push for whether things should digitally expire on the web. So whether if you do things as an 18-year-old, there should be a statute of limitations that when you're 25 they should disappear. Now I'm not talking about serious felonies here, I'm just talking about youthful behaviour. And I think there's quite a lot of debate going on about that. The statute of limitations is a horrible US-orientated phrase, but you understand what I mean, that things are time limited. Because it's very difficult when you've got people at university who are putting their lives online on Facebook and other social media to think that in 25 years' time a very serious corporate employer will probably be trawling the back catalogue of some search engine provider. And I think it's a really interesting one about how you make people aware of those situations.
Well, it can be anyone who wants to get you. It could be some fundamentalist Christians, who say, right, we're going to get them. We don't like this new principle, and bang, they find something you said 20 years ago, which is probably perfectly fine to say 20 years ago, and then was totally politically incorrect, or, it's... I think the idea that particularly the stuff that children and teenagers post needs to disappear is a very interesting one. I think part of the problem is that we're using spaces like, essentially corporate spaces, the Twitters and Facebooks, YouTube, but and they are enormously attractive to me to use as spaces because people are familiar with them, they're free, they're available, they're cross-platform. But their big problem to me is that ultimately we don't have control over them.
Yeah, I mean, within the corporate world, there is several tools around. I mean, the best known probably is Yammer, and Yammer is a Twitter type tool that you can install within a secure intranet. But I mean, it's a bit like email. Email is so easy to either hit print screen or forward or print. And I think it's I often joke about saying you should never resign by email. And I think we are seeing a situation now where some people aren't committing things to email; they're actually doing it by voice call rather than doing it in a written sense.
I'll let someone else have the mic for a while. Just control F2 if you've got a comment, a question, or.
Yeah, I mean, Carol's come up with a very interesting point about the AUP, which is Acceptable Use Policy, for those who don't use the UK terminology. It's quite an interesting one. The fact is that, it's interesting. That's fine, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. But then there's also the idea that Mark just alluded to the problem that things that come back that 5 years ago were acceptable that are being found out that people want to comment on as such.
I think part of the fear is that teachers are now much more worried than they were in previous decades of using provocative examples or being authentic or something in their role and playing it safe. And the problem of playing it safe in education is it can become uninteresting. Like it's actually the general rule is that your risk management strategies can basically undercut your core mission, and that any student can turn on a mobile device and digitally record what you're saying, and then take that to the media or authorities or whatever, and that is pretty worrying, and there will be cases when that's probably legitimate, and there are cases when that, actually harms the institution, or the institution needs to adjust, or we need to adjust society. I think there are risks. I think there's risk in inappropriate risk management.
I think there's also an interesting debate to be had around the fact is there is the idea of the sandbox idea that you can try these things out in a safe environment, but the fact is that once you get out into the wider world, you do have to you do have to learn to either be to size up those risks, evaluate those risks, and there is some issues, and I'm really talking about a learner perspective here, where we've got to look at maybe not exposing youngsters to risk, but making them aware of the risk before it actually becomes a really serious problem.
Malcolm here again, seeing no one else is coming forward. Just inspired by Carol's comment there about if you do involve the kids, they're less likely to complain. One of the things that strikes me about mobiles is a greater capacity, and mobile and social learning in particular, a greater capacity to involve people like parents, grandparents, other supporters, and community organisations and the like in some of the educational programming activities, choosing what's relevant, and that could have great potential benefits and probably a whole lot of new risks that come with that. I wonder if anyone's experimenting with that out there.
I mean, the most, just pick up the interesting one, I think, was the UK example, and it's maybe not from a risk perspective, but just generally. I don't know if you've come across, I'm sure you've all come across the work of Shugata Mitra, who is based in India but now based in Newcastle, of all places. He's doing some really interesting work around the concept of what's called the granny cloud, which is actually getting grannies or older people, seniors, I think, as you may call them in best parts of, involved with mentoring and praising young people. Some really interesting work there. And if you just Google Shugata Mitra, hole in the wall, or granny cloud, it's a really interesting idea. It's interesting because I don't usually conventionally work Mondays, but I go into my primary school where I'm head governor and I teach chess on a Monday at lunchtime. And one of the things is that I'm the only male, it's an all-female primary school, staff primary school, apart from the caretaker. I think that's an interesting one, especially if you've got schools where there is maybe not a gender mix or a mix of different communities. If you can get people in from outside communities, that's a really powerful thing. And that can be done using technology. There's some great examples of people Skyping into schools, or the obvious interchange of Skyping across the globe with various schools, some of the projects going on there.